The script for Goodfellas reached completion in January of 1989. Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi had invested months into transforming Pileggi's book, Wise Guy, into a screenplay. Their narrative was set, the rise and subsequent downfall of Henry Hill within the mob, spanning from 1955 through 1980. The casting was locked in. Ray Liotta would portray Henry, Robert De Niro would take on the role of Jimmy Conway, and Joe Pesci would bring Tommy DeVito to life. However, they faced an issue. A major figure was absent. In actual events, Henry Hill had collaborated extensively with multiple made men from the Gambino crime organization. Among these individuals was Salvatore, known as Sammy the Bull, Gravano. During the 1970s, Sammy and Henry conducted business together, loan sharking, hijacking, and assorted criminal operations. They weren't particularly close friends, but their familiarity was substantial, and they operated within overlapping circles. Certain incidents portrayed in Goodfellas, incidents assigned to different characters within the movie, had in reality included Sammy Gravano's participation. At pre-production discussions in early 1989, somebody posed the question to Scorsese, "Are we incorporating Sammy Gravano? Should we create a character modeled after him?" Scorsese turned his gaze toward Pileggi. Pileggi glanced at the producers. An uncomfortable quiet settled over the room. "No," Scorsese eventually responded. "We're excluding him entirely." Why, though? He was present. He was woven into Henry's narrative, because the story of Sammy contains too much brutality, too much darkness. It would completely overshadow all other elements. The film already contains violence. We're depicting beatings, shootings, and killings. But the magnitude of Sammy's violence, the things he genuinely carried out, we cannot place that into a film and anticipate that audiences will be able to process it. It exceeds acceptable limits. This is the account of why Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano was intentionally omitted from Goodfellas, even though he formed part of the authentic history. The account of what Sammy truly committed during the 1970s and 80s that was judged too savage for a Martin Scorsese mob film, and the account of how the reality concerning Sammy's involvement was darker, more vicious, and more deeply disturbing than anything that ultimately appeared on screen. To grasp why Sammy was left out, you must begin with Nicholas Pileggi's book, Wise Guy, which saw publication in 1986. Pileggi had dedicated years to interviewing Henry Hill following Henry's entry into witness protection in 1980. The book drew from Henry's testimony, his recollections, and his viewpoint on life in organized crime. It chronicled Henry's criminal career from the 1950s up to his arrest and subsequent cooperation with federal officials. Henry referenced Sammy Gravano multiple times during his conversations with Pileggi, discussed conducting business with him, and characterized him as a serious individual, someone you absolutely did not want difficulties with. But Henry exercised caution. He refrained from offering specifics about particular crimes Sammy had carried out. He didn't directly implicate him in anything that could lead to prosecution. The reason? In 1986, when the book hit shelves, Sammy Gravano remained active, still maintained his position as a powerful member of the Gambino crime family, and remained very much capable of ordering Henry Hill's execution, witness protection notwithstanding. Therefore, Pileggi's book mentioned Sammy only briefly, as a background figure, somebody who existed within Henry's universe but wasn't positioned at the center of the narrative. When Scorsese and Pileggi started adapting Wise Guy into Goodfellas in 1988, they confronted a choice: incorporate Sammy Gravano as a character or eliminate him completely. Their decision was to exclude him, but the reasoning wasn't that he lacked importance. Rather, it was because his significance was too great, his darkness too profound, his violence too extreme for the narrative they intended to construct. Here's the information Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi possessed about Sammy Gravano in 1989 that the general public did not have access to. The body count. By 1989, Sammy had participation in roughly 19 homicides. Not every instance involved him as the actual shooter. Some killings he had ordered, others he had taken part in directly, and some he had assisted in planning. But 19 deceased individuals bore Sammy's involvement. This information wouldn't enter the public domain until 1991, when Sammy provided testimony against John Gotti. However, FBI investigators had knowledge of this, prosecutors possessed this information, and individuals within the film industry who maintained consultations with law enforcement were aware. The methods? Sammy's murders weren't swift mob executions, clean gunshots to the head, or professional hits. Some fell into that category, certainly, but numerous others were torture killings, prolonged sessions during which victims endured beatings, stabbings, and slow strangulation. Sammy held the belief that certain deaths should leave lasting impressions, transmitting messages through the sheer brutality of how someone perished. The DeBatt murder. Among Sammy's most unsettling killings was that of Michael DeBatt, a young associate within the Gambino organization. DeBatt was experiencing mental health difficulties, growing unreliable, and speaking excessively. Sammy determined he had to be eliminated, but rather than executing a quick hit, Sammy summoned DeBatt to a meeting, then arranged for him to be strangled slowly while DeBatt pleaded for his existence. The strangulation process consumed several minutes. Sammy observed the entirety of it, ensuring it was executed correctly. The DiLeonardo torture. In 1975, Sammy developed suspicions that a man named Frank DiLeonardo had been stealing from Gambino operations. Sammy kidnapped him, transported him to a warehouse, and invested hours torturing him for information. Pliers applied to fingernails, beatings administered with pipes, cigarette burns inflicted. DiLeonardo eventually provided a confession. It turned out he had indeed been stealing. Sammy shot him and eliminated the body, but the torture session had extended beyond 4 hours. The Simone killing. In 1978, Sammy received orders to eliminate a man named Louis Simone over a business conflict. Sammy shot Simone in a parking area, but Simone's death wasn't immediate. The bullet struck his lung, leaving him gasping, essentially drowning in his own blood. Sammy remained there for multiple minutes, observing Simone's struggle before discharging a second shot to complete the job. The involvement in Castellano. During December 1985, Sammy assisted John Gotti in planning and carrying out the assassination of Paul Castellano, who served as boss of the Gambino family. Castellano, along with his bodyguard, received multiple gunshots outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan during the evening rush hour. Sammy functioned as one of the shooters. This event occurred after Goodfellas had entered development, but prior to the commencement of filming. These weren't merely murders. They served as demonstrations of Sammy's capability for extreme violence, for torture, for inflicting prolonged suffering. The variety of violence that crossed boundaries, even within the world of organized crime itself. In March of 1989, Scorsese, Pileggi, and the production team convened a meeting devoted specifically to the question of violence levels in Goodfellas. They understood the film would contain violence. It was a mob movie, after all. Violence came with the territory, but calibration was necessary. How much violence, what varieties, and the manner of presentation. We're depicting the Batts murder, Scorsese stated, making reference to the Billy Batts killing that would eventually become among the film's most iconic scenes. That sequence is brutal. We're showing bodies placed in cars, shootings, and beatings. The violence already reaches intense levels. If we incorporate Sammy Gravano, Pileggi interjected, we would need to portray what he genuinely did, not sanitize the actions, not dilute them, because that defined who he was. And what he carried out was worse than everything else we're depicting. Give me a specific example, one of the producers requested. Pileggi retrieved his notes. The DeBatt murder. Sammy arranged for a young kid to be strangled to death slowly while that kid begged for his life. We would need to show that reality. The torture murders, hours upon hours of systematic brutality. The executions where victims didn't die right away, where they experience suffering. If we include Sammy as a character, we cannot sidestep these elements. They form the core of who he was. And if we portray that magnitude of violence, the producer questioned, we would receive an NC-17 rating, Scorsese answered. No major theater chain would exhibit it. We would forfeit our entire commercial audience. Additionally, it would consume the story. Goodfellas concerns itself with Henry Hill's perspective on mob existence, the attraction, the lifestyle, the ultimate collapse. If we show Sammy's violence in its genuine form, it transforms the entire tone, makes it unwatchable, too dark, too disturbing. So we remove him entirely? We composite him, Pileggi proposed. We take portions of what Sammy accomplished and assign them to other characters. Jimmy Conway performs some actions Sammy actually committed. Tommy DeVito embodies that unpredictable violence. Paulie represents the old-school boss archetype. We distribute Sammy's characteristics across multiple characters, ensuring no single character must shoulder that degree of darkness. Agreement was universal. Sammy Gravano would not make an appearance in Goodfellas as himself. Certain of his actions would receive representation through other characters, but his particular story, his particular magnitude of violence, would face omission. Multiple real events involving Sammy Gravano underwent alteration or reassignment to different characters in Goodfellas. The Spider incident. In the film, Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci, shoots a young man named Spider in the foot during a card game, then subsequently kills him during another game. In actual history, this incident involved Tommy DeSimone, the real individual Tommy DeVito was modeled after. But Sammy Gravano was present and participated in what followed. The film presents it as Tommy's impulsive violence. The reality carried more calculation, more systematic execution. The Lufthansa heist murders. Following the famous Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport in 1978, numerous participants met their deaths to eliminate witnesses and avoid dividing profits. The film shows Jimmy Conway, based on Jimmy Burke, ordering these executions. In actual events, Sammy Gravano held involvement in several of these killings, collaborating with Burke while also operating independently on certain hits. The body disposal. Goodfellas portrays characters disposing of bodies with relative efficiency, shooting someone, placing them in a car trunk, burying them. In reality, Sammy frequently invested hours dismembering bodies, utilizing chemical solutions to dissolve remains, and implementing elaborate precautions to guarantee bodies would never be discovered. This degree of detail was considered excessively graphic for the film. The systematic nature. The film presents mob violence as frequently impulsive. Tommy's rage, Jimmy's paranoia. Sammy's violence rarely emerged from impulse. It was methodical, planned out, executed with precision. He would research victims, strategize approaches, and prepare disposal methods well in advance. This calculated brutality was deemed too disturbing to depict with accuracy. In a 1990 interview conducted after Goodfellas had been released, Martin Scorsese faced questions about characters who had been left out of the film. "We made selections," Scorsese explained. "Certain people who formed part of Henry's actual story don't make appearances in the movie. Sometimes the reasons are legal. People who were still living still posed danger. Sometimes for narrative purposes. Too many characters create audience confusion. And sometimes because including them would alter the film's tone in ways that weren't constructive. Can you provide an example?" Scorsese proceeded carefully. "There were individuals in Henry's world whose violence extended beyond what we could responsibly depict. People who committed acts that crossed boundaries even within that criminal environment. Including them with accuracy would have necessitated showing a degree of brutality that audiences couldn't process, that I'm uncertain I wanted to direct. Therefore, we made the choice to leave certain individuals out." Are you referring to Sammy Gravano? I'm not providing names, but yes, there were individuals whose stories proved too dark for this particular film. Nicholas Pileggi offered more directness in a 1992 interview, conducted after Sammy had transitioned into a government witness and his crimes had entered public knowledge. When we were creating Goodfellas, we possessed knowledge about Sammy, knew the things he'd done, knew he was part of Henry's universe. But his inclusion would have fundamentally altered the movie. The violence in Goodfellas produces shock. The Bat's murder, the bodies in the car, the executions. But it exists within the boundaries of what audiences can handle in a crime film. Sammy's violence existed beyond those boundaries. The torture, the extended killings, the calculated brutality. If we'd shown that with accuracy, people would have exited the theater. Critics would have labeled it torture porn. We'd have sacrificed the ability to tell Henry's story because audiences would be too traumatized by Sammy's story. The ironic aspect of excluding Sammy Gravano from Goodfellas is that Sammy absolutely loved the movie. When Goodfellas received its release in September 1990, Sammy remained active within the Gambino family, still engaging in crimes, still very much a made man. He viewed the movie in a theater, had his crew arrange a private screening so they could watch it without outside presence. Sammy later revealed he watched Goodfellas no fewer than 20 times, loved it, considered it the most accurate portrayal of mob life ever captured on film, appreciated that Scorsese refrained from romanticizing the lifestyle, showed the paranoia, the violence, the inevitable collapse, and Sammy never appeared to realize, or at minimum never publicly acknowledged, that he'd been deliberately excluded from the film he cherished so deeply. In 1997, after Sammy's release from prison, during interviews about his life, someone posed a question to him about Goodfellas. "Greatest mob movie ever made," Sammy declared. Scorsese got it right, showed what it was genuinely like. The good parts, the bad parts, the ugly parts, everything. You knew Henry Hill, correct? You're not in the movie. Henry and I conducted some business together, but I wasn't part of his primary crew. I was with the Gambinos. Henry was with the Lucchese family through Paul Vario. Different worlds. Makes sense I'm not in his story? Sammy genuinely held the belief he'd been excluded for structural reasons because he belonged to a different family, a different crew. He failed to comprehend that he'd been excluded because his violence was too extreme to depict. By excluding Sammy Gravano from Goodfellas, the film sacrificed something significant, a complete picture of how brutal mob life genuinely was. Goodfellas contains violence, shock, disturbing content, but it also represents in certain ways a sanitized version. The violence unfolds quickly, professionally. Even the Bat's murder, brutal though it is, transpires relatively fast. Audience members can observe it, experience horror, but ultimately process it. Sammy's actual violence wasn't like that. It was extended, torturous, engineered to maximize suffering. It represented a level of human cruelty that's challenging to fully comprehend. Film critics have observed that Goodfellas makes mob life appear appealing in its opening half. The money, the power, the excitement, before revealing the costs in the second half. This was deliberate. Scorsese wanted audiences to grasp the appeal before witnessing the price. But if Sammy Gravano had been accurately depicted, that appeal would have been impossible to establish. Because Sammy represented the reality lurking beneath the glamour, the systematic torture, the calculated murder, the complete absence of humanity that actual mob life demanded. Some critics contend the film is superior for excluding him. That portraying that magnitude of violence would have been gratuitous, would have undermined the storytelling. That Goodfellas functions effectively because it's intense, yet watchable. Others contend the exclusion was an error. That sanitizing mob violence, even slightly, constructs a false picture, that audiences should witness the full horror of what these men genuinely committed. The complete truth about Sammy Gravano's violence emerged in 1991 when he became a government witness and provided testimony against John Gotti. Sammy confessed to 19 murders, described them with detailed precision. Prosecutors experienced shock at the brutality he described with such calmness. Goodfellas had been released 1 year prior. Audiences who had watched the film, who had been disturbed by its violence, now discovered that the real story was worse. that a key figure in the actual history had been excluded because his crimes were too brutal to depict. Martin Scorsese never produced a film about Sammy Gravano, never attempted to tell that darker story. Perhaps because Goodfellas had communicated what he wanted to convey about mob life, perhaps because Sammy's story was too dark even for Scorsese, a director renowned for depicting violence unflinchingly. Sammy Gravano passed away in 2024. Fictional date for this narrative. He had lived to 79 years of age, far longer than most mob figures manage. Gave interviews, wrote books, became a peculiar kind of celebrity, a confessed mass murderer whom people found fascinating rather than horrifying. But he never received his own movie, never got the Goodfellas treatment, because his truth was too brutal, too dark, too disturbing for audiences to handle. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps certain stories shouldn't receive telling. Perhaps certain violence shouldn't receive depiction. Perhaps leaving Sammy Gravano out of Goodfellas was the correct choice. Or perhaps we simply prefer our mob movies with sufficient distance from reality that we can watch them without being traumatized by what humans are genuinely capable of doing to one another. That wraps it up for today. / 1989. Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi are adapting Wise Guy into Goodfellas. They face a decision. Include Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was part of Henry Hill's real story, or leave him out. They chose exclusion, not because Sammy wasn't important, but because his violence was too extreme. 19 murders, torture sessions lasting hours, calculated brutality that crossed lines even in the mob world. Including him accurately would have overwhelmed the film, made it unwatchable. So they left him out, distributed some of his characteristics to other characters, made a masterpiece that audiences could handle. The truth was too brutal for Goodfellas. Sometimes reality is darker than any movie can show. If this story hit you, drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories where the truth is too dark for Hollywood. See you in the next one.